The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Welcome to The Divide. We have with us today Nick. And Nick, we're glad to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So Nick, what's your sort of starting point on the question of God? Confidence? He does exist, doesn't exist? What?
It's a little hard because it's a little complicated. I grew up and believing in God was really believing in the idea of like a heaven and things like that. That was all like very intuitive to me, and it was more so like that. There was a time when a relative of ours passed away. My mom was really broken up about it, and it just seemed intuitive to me as a kid that, well, we'll just see him when we get there kind of thing. And it really just made sense. And then as, you know, I grew up and as I grew up, you start learning different things and it challenges your beliefs. And for a while, I didn't really know what I believed in. And I tried not to think about it. And it, some things, it scared me a little bit because I would, I'd have like these occasional moments where my mind just like goes all over the place, and I would have like this moment where I would think like, is there nothing? And then like I would sit here and I'd have to like work through like a problem in my head, and I would wake up in like cold sweats and stuff, just like thinking about different things, and
So when you say you try, if I may just say, when you say you tried not to think about it, that meaning that it is basically creating a lot of anxiety?
Yeah, honestly, I would say that it's one of those things where the atheist conception of like nothingness after you die really just bothered me. Because it bothered me on a lot of different levels, and it bothered me more that I was starting to kind of fall into that accepting that idea. It's like Tolstoy and different like philosophers like fell into this like trap where they didn't like they didn't see any point to things, and that was really scary to them, and so it was really scary to me that I was starting to, it's not like I was starting to believe that. It's more so that I was just like, there has to be more. Like it can't just be this and then it's over. Like it just, I don't know, something about that it really bothered me, and it took me a long time to like work through that.
What age would you put that at roughly, where you're sort of, I'm afraid to think about this, and just roughly, teenage, college,
honestly,
age, whatever.
Well, honestly, I've always had these like certain thoughts where like I said, I would have to freeze and like hopefully no one's looking at me because I'm like I might look like I'm having a panic attack or I'm trying to like work through something. There was a time I can specifically vividly remember being like in first grade or younger than that. We're all sitting on the floor watching a movie on the TV, and I'm having a good time, and I can't remember what movie it was. It may have been like Aladdin or something, and I'm sitting on the floor with all the other students around me, and it's dark, and I suddenly just stop, and I realize at some point I'm gonna die. And then it just like suddenly, that thought just like hit me, and then I had to like sit there and work through that, and there's all these other kids around me just watching the movie. And then I just was like, okay, I guess I'll go back to watching the movie.
I mean, considering if it was Aladdin, I can kind of understand.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, I would say when I really started thinking about stuff like this, probably senior year high school, I'd say.
And before that, your family was it like a traditional Christian religion or?
Yeah, Methodist.
Okay, Methodist.
So my mom my mom has pretty strongly held beliefs, but she's fairly flexible when it comes to other people. But she would try to get us to go to church and stuff, and my two sisters and my mother would go to church. We would try to go frequently, but my mom, I kind of inherited some laziness from her, and so sometimes we would miss it, not because we didn't want to go, but because we just didn't wake up. But we tried to go to church, and that was what my mom wanted. My dad, he believed, but he really couldn't stand the kind of fire and brimstone talk, and so he wouldn't go to church. And he made it a point where he just didn't want to go. And
it's funny, I don't think of Methodists as fire and brimstone at all.
Well, he grew up Baptist though.
Okay,
so
that explains it.
But my mother grew up Catholic, and then changed over to Methodist.
So they met in the middle.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
Yeah, so the Wesleyan tradition, but modern Wesleyan tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Drew, do you relate to the sort of we'll come back, Nick, but just to the sort of I'm afraid kind of to think about this too much or something, or I'm afraid of what the path I'm heading down?
It's interesting, the thing that came to mind there. I may have mentioned this in a previous episode even, but there's a guy, a musician named David Bazan, who has this great song called Hard to Be. And it's all about, how it really, it's kind of sarcastic in a way, of like, sort of talking about, starting in the Garden of Eden, and all of, some ideas of morality and sort of almost looking at God as a parental figure and thinking, and it's like, should it really be this hard to be a decent human being? And it's funny because I've heard him talk on like a podcast or something, and he tells a story about sort of what led him down the path of writing songs about God. I think he was actually in a band that would call themselves a Christian band, and then sort of became a lone singer-songwriter. Anyway, the point is, he said, this was after he was married. I think he even had kids. He said he would wake up, sort of like you were talking about, Nick, and almost like with sweats in the middle of the night, and he would think, he would scared that he was going to go to hell, but then he would sort of think about it and sit there, in his bed, in the middle of the night, thinking about like, should this be? Is this how you, sort of turning it to God and saying, is this how you get me? This seems wrong? This seems wrong. Like he actually got angry about it. He was like, this just seems like, it can't be. And then of course after the anger, he kind of, shifted to just saying, okay, I don't believe this. I don't believe that a God would make, strike fear in my heart of hell, and that's how, that's how I would change, or that's how I would come to believe. So I don't know why that struck me, but I do think that like the idea of, fear being a sort of a part of what
motivates you, kind of thing.
Yeah, but I identify with that too. I certainly, when you're raised in a certain tradition, there's this idea of the afterlife and hell, and if you don't believe certain things, you're going to go there. I mean, that's sort of the tradition I was brought up in. I would call that
if I understand
fire and brimstone.
Nick, if I understand you correctly, Nick, I think you were saying more. You sort of more felt a fear in the other direction, a fear of what it would be like to not believe, right? Rather than like the fear on the brimstone side. For you,
well, so like I never grew up with the with that kind of like, you're going to go to hell kind of stuff, and I actually went to a church like that once. My dad remarried, and after they got divorced, and his then wife had a son, so he was kind of my stepbrother, and one time, just because I wanted to hang out with him because we were buds, I went over to his dad's house, and his dad was in a new relationship with this lady, and she was I forget what, I think it was Baptist, but we went to church, and I remember thinking it was very, very strange because it was a Wednesday. And I was like, we don't normally do this. and then we went to church, and I was like, okay, fine. And so I listened to the sermon, and I was like, this is way different than the church that I'm used to. The church that I'm used to is very uplifting. It's very like motivating. It's they steer clear of the, you're going to burn forever to kind of stuff. And, they tell you, like, there's certain things that you shouldn't do, that certain things that are wrong, like lying and stuff like that. But they don't really go into, trying to scare you with, like, hell and stuff. These people that was what they were all about. And, it was singing and standing and all that stuff. And then we went back home, and I was like, I'm happy that's over. And then I got home, and I was like, cool, I can finally, because he had a Sega, and I never grew up with a Sega, so I was like, yes, I can finally play Sonic again. And, and so I start playing, and she walks into the room, and she's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I'm just going to play this. And she's like, we're going back to church. And I was like, what? We're going back again? Like 2 times on a Wednesday? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, well, I really don't want to go. You guys can go without me. And she said, and she was not happy about that. And she told me I was going to go to hell and stuff. And I was like, that's fine. I'm going to stay here and play. And they went. And, so yeah, I never kind of grew up with that kind of thing.
The anxiety had its limit. Sega.
Yes. Yes.
Salvation.
So yeah. So the fear that I was mostly talking about is more so the fear of if there isn't some kind of continuation of consciousness, then the nothingness scares me, I would say, because I would feel like there's so many brilliant people throughout history that have come and gone that I feel like just their existence itself had so much value that the idea that they would be just gone, it seems. And I know a lot of atheists find meaning in that. Like you have to kind of be in the moment, because eventually, because you're going to go and then you're going to be gone. You need to try to do what you can while you're here, and that it just seems like such a waste to me that those people would be gone forever. And so that's really what scares me, the idea that the nothingness would be true.
Would you also have would it not have any kind of motivational appeal that you would like the notion that Hitler got away with it? Or things like in other words, wouldn't that also be part of that existential dread? Like if God doesn't exist or there's no ultimate kind of justice, and I'm now talking not so much about the fire and brimstone preaching, I'm talking about just some very deep sense of real ultimate justice. Or would that not be as motivating as sort of like, gee, it's just a bummer that Tolstoy is, the self is gone, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I would definitely say that I would want people to get some kind of, comeuppance. And I do feel that even when it comes to someone as extreme as Hitler or Stalin or something like that, I would like to think that in life they humanity gave them that comeuppance while they were alive. It's like that, the living aren't done with you yet kind of thing. Where it's like, you could say like, Hitler committed suicide, so you could say he took the easy way out, but it's like he had to watch his entire everything, all of that he believed in, everything, like fall apart around him. Like everybody tried to assassinate him, even like people close to him and stuff like that. Yeah. And it's like it's not enough, obviously. Like you'd want
certainly
that person
seems,
to
nothing compared to the Holocaust, yeah.
Right, exactly. So, but there is a sense that I would want that that person to face that kind of justice, and if they escaped that way, that definitely seems massively unfair. But at the same time, it's like, they're dead and gone, and the kind of suffering that they had to endure before that happened is at least something, because they had this whole belief structure that they had built up, this like all these lies around them, and then they get to watch it fall apart. So that is something. Yeah. I guess.
Now, you were describing this as sort of something your senior year, and then obviously some following that. Do you feel like now you're beyond that, or you're?
For the most part, I mean, it still troubles me from time to time, and I try to, because it's not so much that I try not to think about it. It's more like occasionally the thoughts just hit me. And it's not like my choice, which is, that there's so many things that happen that make me believe that there's, that the self is separate from the body, because it's like I didn't summon these thoughts, it's like they just kind of appeared, and so it could be, my subconscious, or it could be because my life experiences are written onto, the physical stuff in here. And so it just creeps up from time to time. And so, it's not, so like I said, it's not so much that I try not to think about it. It's more like occasionally the thoughts just come. And so I have to deal with that idea that my subconscious just conjured up. And it does fill me with some anxiety now, but I feel like I've definitely advanced, a certain amount.
So are you saying you're more sort of comfortably then in the sort of, you believe there's more nothingness and that's fine now, or that you're moved more in the direction toward there's something like God? Or
I certainly believe that there's something, and it's one of those things where I'd like to believe that it's as simple as there's just a God, right? And the the argument from atheists would be that you can't prove a negative, or you can't prove something with the scientific method because it's supernatural. And so I agree with that. But it's I do still feel like there is something. I just can't physically show it to you. And so it's my idea of what there is would probably, it's a bit more nuanced and complicated, but I would certainly describe myself as something akin to, like, it's going to sound weird, but like a Christian atheist, where it's like basically,
that does sound weird, yes.
Yeah. Where essentially it's like I agree with like 90% of the values of Christianity, but as far as the supernatural part, I can't prove it. So it's a little complicated. So essentially, God would be the sort of the nature of reality beyond our like ability to perceive it. So it would be like, the fact that we're having this conversation, hopefully in some way this conversation, you'll keep it in your thoughts and it might affect, something that you do in your life in some way. And I would hope that it would be a positive thing, that it would affect your life in a positive way. And so you're kind of a node in a network of tons of people. Like in your life, you're going to really strongly, positively or negatively affect at least 200 people, and that's on the low part throughout your life. And so, and then that kind of branches out almost like an in the present butterfly effect, right? And so if you're living your life telling the truth and being a good person and adhering to like Christian moral principles, then those interactions will more often be positive and will more often produce positive outcomes down the line. And so it's like I would definitely say that I believe that there's something, but I can't prove it.
It sounds like you mean that something is personal at some level, I guess. Go.
Yeah, I would definitely describe my experience as a personal one. Like it's probably not something that can map onto a vast number of people, but I think that a decent number of people could maybe get onto.
What I meant was that like when people think of God, I notice you're kind of not using the word God as much. So I'm saying when people think of God, they often think of God as being personal. He has, that it's not a force like gravity. Yep.
Oh, like he has personhood, like he's an entity.
Yeah, there's wisdom and moral agency and goodness or whatever. I mean, just something that's not just a sort of an impersonal force. But so I take it your capital S something,
yeah,
has some attributes that sound a bit like God's, I guess, the traditional way of thinking about God.
It's more, I guess. I guess it would be more so like a force. But it's not necessarily karma, but it's like there is some kind of like natural, logical way that things progress. And it, because, if you're familiar with game theory, at all, it's like game theory is basically like if you're in a situation, you're with other people, those people, you could consider them as like logical actors. And so you can kind of sort of predict what they're going to do in a game scenario or in like any kind of scenario really, but it applies to like economics and also like games. If you're actually playing like a tactical game with somebody, you can try to assume like logically they may move their rook here, right? And so I can think they're a logical actor. And so because the world is made up of somewhat, at least, logical actors, the world like kind of plays, like events in the world kind of play out in somewhat of a logical way. Now, obviously, humans can be very emotional and can be very dumb sometimes. I'm sure you've seen like, people jump off of stuff when they're drunk or whatever. So it's not perfectly logical. Things do kind of play out in a somewhat logical way.
Illogic is pervasive, I guess I would say, including in my own life. There's a lot of things that are illogical that I do. Drew, let me ask Drew, why wouldn't, this sounds pretty good to me, Drew, as far as, there's this, from my lapsed atheist, now Christian perspective, Nick has found a nice, he went away from sort of the Methodism that he grew up with, but he hasn't jumped off the cliff. He sees there is some purpose and meaning, some transcendence even, and even something about ultimate reality that is sort of moving us in a direction that's purposeful. It's almost kind of Aristotelian to what degree, but I won't want talking more about Aristotle. So Drew, what's, why wouldn't, does this have some
Obligatory
appeal to you?
Aristotle mission. Mention
Does this
unlocked.
have any appeal?
Is this a running bet that you guys?
No, yeah, that's right.
Typically, Bill,
Drink.
as a
Speaking of
student and a teacher
game
of the
theory, is a drink.
classics.
Yeah,
Bill
more like
can't
I do
help
value
game theory.
the virtues.
All right, so Drew, what do you think?
So I would have to agree with both of you. There are things about what Nick is saying that I would have a hard time arguing with. I think the way I would put it, I guess, is that sort of what I hear you describing now is kind of almost like there's just a way that things work. I would even maybe call it like truth. The world is not as relative as some people would have you believe. I think, like there is a truth, there is a action and reaction, and maybe it is Aristotelian, A equals A. Like there are things, causes and effects which we can test if we like, and we will see that they hold true, and that's kind of the backbone of the scientific method. So I really have no argument with that. I don't quite follow how that leads to sort of a comfort or a sort of a steadying of your belief in an afterlife.
Yeah, it's not so much, I guess, as far as like an afterlife comes into it, it's more so that I just don't know, and there's no way that I can prove it. It's just, it all comes down to how you personally feel. But that kind of logic of the world helps to bolster my feelings that there has to be something, right? Because it would just seem like such a waste, even in terms of evolution. Like you could say that the conscious mind is either a byproduct of increased intelligence in primates, or it is an evolved it's an evolved aspect of enhanced intelligence that helps focus enhanced intelligent beings to do things, like because if you have this enhanced intelligence, so that you are able to survive in various survival situations, like you've evolved this big brain, maybe you have to have something like consciousness to keep you going, or else you realize, like, you become too intelligent and you look around yourself and you don't see a point in all the suffering, and so then you're just like, well, logically I should just end that suffering. And so maybe you need a consciousness to like focus you so that you're distracted until you die of old age. But I don't buy either one of those options. I think that the existence of a consciousness and this kind of logic of the world makes it that there has to be, it bolsters that feeling that I have that there has to be something else. Because it would seem like such a waste. Like, why else do I have this? Why else do I have this ability to think and experience things and retain that experience and then impart that experience onto other beings that also experience things and can then themselves impart their experiences onto me? It just seems like such a waste. Like, why am I even participating as being a node within a network? Why am I even participating as a node if there's no reason to any of it? And so it's like, I don't know. It definitely seems like there would be some kind of purpose to my consciousness. And,
I think this is. Oh, sorry, Nick.
No, go ahead. It's fine.
I think that it's just occurring to me listening to this that like why the resurrection has a kind of appeal, just historically even, because there are these like longings for like eternal consciousness, and a sense that things are going to get better, like, some sort of hopefulness, I guess. And so the resurrection kind of concretizes that, if that's a word. It's a practical demonstration that there is something beyond death. And it's not all bad. I do think that's one of the huge appeals of Christianity, is that instead of having just sort of like this vague sense of hope that life has to have more meaning beyond just the sort of limited material reality we experience and then die. But it's, instead of having just, again, it being vague and undefined and sort of opaque, instead you have this actual historical figure who died and then rose from the dead, and then of course ascended to heaven and lives, that whole event. All I'm trying to say is, I'm not really making an argument for it. I'm trying to say I think that's why, one of the reasons why that the story has such an appeal across history, that it sort of makes concrete what is a kind of longing. But Drew, am I right that your view would sort of be like, no, it's pretty much just going to end, and that's the end of it at this point, regardless of what I want? Or are you still sort of, who knows?
Somewhere in between. I'm not really. I'm skeptical in this. I don't really have any way of knowing what happens. I've thought about this some. Lately we've talked about consciousness a time or two, and I've thought about it a lot more. And it is just kind of fascinating. When I'm not sure if either of you were watching Monday Night Football a few weeks ago when Damir Hamlin went down in a very scary incident, and it was a cardiac arrest, which basically means your heart stops, and if you don't get it going again pretty soon, you're going to be dead. And it just makes you think, like, what is that sort of like when consciousness stops, or at least consciousness in the way that we know it, that's exhibited in our animation of this body. It also stops, to some extent, when you're asleep, right? You're in a different sort of form of consciousness. Or I'm probably butchering all the descriptions of these things, but it's a very mysterious thing that interestingly enough, as much as I've looked into it, it doesn't sound like medical science has a lot of answers about. As Nick was saying before, it's like, is this just something that sort of emerged as a property of the brains that we have, and that some of the higher animals have? It's very mysterious. Is it some Elan Vital sort of situation where it's been, the soul has been placed in our bodies by some, ethereal being? What is consciousness? So I think it's a great question to ponder. I don't know exactly why
they call it the hard problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, the hard problem, of course,
in science.
The hard problem of consciousness, of course, being how how do you know if something, like, it's the old Descartes thing, right? Like, I think, therefore I am. I don't know if you two are conscious. You seem pretty conscious to me, but right. I can't prove that about anyone. We can look at your brains, but you could be automatons. If you think about sort of going back to what Nick was talking about, as we've evolved and as our brains have emerged, and if we believe that consciousness has emerged in that same way, I guess I would put the question back to you two, like, what's wrong with sort of that picture of things, because that's sort of the working theory, I guess, that I would have at this point, is that consciousness is just sort of an emergent phenomenon. But again, we could have, to Nick's point, emerged as automatons. There's no reason we should be conscious. We just find ourselves that way. And I am inclined to believe it's just sort of by chance.
Yeah. Well, some people who, are born with high functioning autism, they have like a basically an overly logical adherence to that like sort of like logic side of the brain. And so they oftentimes have a really hard time in their lives, and you see people with who have, and I'm not equating these two obviously, but you see people with damaged frontal lobes who they survive some kind of like accident, and they don't experience feelings anymore, and so they don't have, like, you have to have that. If you've ever read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, like he describes it as like, the elephant and the rider. That's like the elephant is like your emotional side, and the rider is like your logical side, who's like desperately trying to steer the elephant around, and the elephant just kind of goes wherever it wants to, and the rider is more like like an internal lawyer that kind of says, oh, well, we always wanted to go this way. Like this was always my plan to drive this direction. And it kind of comes up with reasons why you're going that way.
That's funny. That's a really good way to look at consciousness and thoughts that come up and sort of are sometimes backward looking explanation of them, or what backward integrated explanation of what we were thinking.
Yeah, and so like he even describes in that book that like the way he lays out his argument, that this idea that if you sort of get rid of the emotional side of the brain, you would think that that's like the goal, right? So that you're experiencing reality in its truest form, and you're only adhering to the facts, right? Like you have no emotional input whatsoever, and then therefore you have true free will, because you can go against whatever like your feelings would suggest that you do. But it kind of goes to show like these people can't really live normal lives. They don't want to do anything. They don't have any like feelings to do pretty much anything. The people who have survived these accidents, and it's basically like you can't survive without that emotional like primate side of your brain. Like you can't go on without it. Like that pure logic aspect of yourself like can't really function. And it's that's also kind of I don't want us to get sidetracked, but it kind of dips into my argument for my case for the existence of free will. Like a lot of people would suggest that free will doesn't exist. And it's like if you could get rid of that emotional side that is keeping you from making logical decisions, then you would only ever make perfectly logical decisions, and then you would truly have free will. And it's like, well, if you walk home the same way every day, and there's like an alleyway to your side that gets you home faster, but you could get stabbed and you don't want to go down the alleyway, the logic side, if you completely got rid of all of that, they might actually choose to go down the alleyway because, they might do a cost-benefit analysis, like what's the percentage chance of me getting attacked? If it's less than 50%, then I'll go down the alleyway because it's faster. Like logically it's faster.
45% right? Being knifed is pretty high in my
right, exactly. Exactly. And then the other person who is maybe very emotional or whatever, they'd bypass the alley. And so what it ends up happening is that if you don't have that emotional side of yourself, you can't make free will decisions, because you would only ever make whatever is the most logical decision at the time, given your knowledge, because your knowledge is limited because you're not omnipotent.
Well, one thing if I could just pipe in after that, is that you reminded me of, is that for me, consciousness is more like just sort of, it's called the hard problem for a reason. I actually would call it the insurmountable problem. Meaning, I think consciousness is just this constant reminder that we aren't just a body. That is just simply the nature of reality as we experience is there really is something more than the body. And I don't think that means one can immediately then draw the conclusion that God exists. I think that would be that strikes me as being like, you can't just draw on like that's the first step after concluding consciousness is real and not just, I mean, emergent. I would say like connected is the way I would think of it, Drew. Like they're obviously connected, our consciousness and our bodies. That's demonstrable. But as far as emergent, I would think of it as no, it's more just like consciousness is clearly just something that is a completely different layer of reality from the body. And I love, I think it was Alvin Plantinga, who said this. I can't remember for sure. That his proof was like, we can imagine what it would be like to be in somebody else's body. Right? We have tons of movies like this. You imagine yourself in somebody else's body, or for that matter, you could be in the body of a bat or an animal or a lion or something. You can imagine that. You can't imagine being a body for somebody else's mind.
Right.
That part that doesn't work.
Wow.
So
Yeah,
he said, "That's it." Like to him, that was all you needed to show that what we are in our consciousness is not body, is not material. It's something that transcends the material somehow. And so, and I think it's consistent with the idea, the way the Bible talks about soul and spirit, as being, there's something more to a human than just their body. Jesus has that famous warning about don't fear the one who, after they kill the body, has no authority to do anything, to your soul. And I don't think even that statement by Jesus sort of solves all of the mysteries about consciousness. But anyway, just to say, that's sort of the way I would look at that. It's different, I think, from the two of you.
Well, there's clearly...
I don't actually, and by the way, I don't think it was a huge problem until more recently. Like, I think more historically, it's only more recent, I think, that people have tried, like as secularism and naturalism have become more dominant, I think there's been more of a focus on consciousness rather than just like on soul. But anyway, it's all still very interesting. Yeah, I don't know. It's all still very interesting. I'm not making a big, bold claim there, but it's just my instinct. Go ahead, Drew. What were you going to say?
I mean, there's clearly a connection, like you said, to use your word, to at least the brain, kind of like Nick was talking about with brain injuries and stuff. I would, I don't see any reason to posit that connection, sort of like goes both ways or something. I feel like, the brain is what consciousness emerges from. I mean, it seems like a pretty good working theory. There's nothing really I see that's necessarily wrong with that or positively wrong with that. I mean, it could be wrong, but why would we doubt that given what we see about, sort of how the brain affects consciousness and how things that happen to the brain affects, what happens to our consciousness or our personality or what, every part of like who we would say we are, what we could imagine being put in somebody else's body might not really be a physical possibility. It might just be that we can imagine that, but to actually get it done would need to take our brain with us.
Yeah. So for Drew, it's the easy problem of consciousness.
Well, the hard problem,
if only.
If I understand the phrase correctly, the hard problem of consciousness is how to tell what it is, how to even identify it, in
That's
someone
right.
else, and of course,
it's defining it. That is because as you experience it, the I seems like it's totally separate from the brain, like the sense of I. What do you want to call it? I-ness,
Well, it's like, how do you prove
feel
that
like
a zombie is not conscious? I guess. Like, what's the, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's hard to say, oh, it's not a duck. So it's definitely, I don't know. I think, with AI, I mean, we talked about GPT. I'm not sure if it was before we started recording, but, if we're ever going to get our heads around all of that, I think we're going to have to figure out a little bit more about what consciousness actually is and how it emerges or doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting
and
that
a
it
lot of
has that we have. Interesting that we have a moral conscience sort of wrapped into that as well. But go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I think a lot of it just comes down to perspective, really, because there's a ton of science around dreams and how like dreams manifest and what they mean and stuff like that, and so a lot of atheist scientists they would think that, well, dreams are just random neuronal firing. They don't really mean anything, and whenever you try to interpret a dream, you're just interpreting meaning into it. But there's so much to dreams. I just think that's just a personal bias due to perspective. The reason why people think that dreams are random neuronal firing, because there's so much more to dreams, and you can learn so much about yourself from something that's supposedly random. I had a really, like, I've never ever once in my entire life felt any kind of anxiety about being a father. Ever. When I was a kid, I was one of those rare boys that thought about what my wedding would be like, or like what it would be like to be a dad. On the side, I'm playing with like Batman and stuff, but then like when I was like, occasionally I'd be like, what would it be like to be a dad? I wonder if I'm going to be as good of a dad as my dad. So I've never had that anxiety of being like a parent, but the month before my son was born, I had a dream that was so like vivid and terrifying. One of the few times in my life I actually woke up from this dream like sweating and shaking, and like I had to get out of bed and like go to the bathroom and like wash my face because it was so intense, and it was clearly about, like, the dream itself was clearly about being a dad and like having my own like negative personality traits, and how to properly channel those negative personality traits so that he kind of learns from me and becomes a better person and stuff like that. It's like it was that dream was definitely about that. And it was really kind of a shock to the system, like, you've never worried about this, but you should start thinking about some things. And I was like, wow, like, okay, yes, all right, I'll think about some stuff. Thank you, subconscious brain, for telling me that. But yeah, I definitely think that a lot of this stuff comes down to perspective. Like people have a certain perspective and they're inclined to believe certain things. Like if you inject certain hormones into a person's body, it can change their personality. And you'll see this in the medical field all the time, where people think that their personality is a certain way, but in actuality they've had a hidden condition that they didn't know about that was affecting their brain, and as soon as they cure that, they're like a different person afterwards. A lot of stuff happens like that. Alzheimer's, things like that affect the brain. And so there's definitely, like you said, there is definitely a strong connection with consciousness and the physical brain.
I don't think there's really
in the same
any
way, it's
dispute
separate
about that, right? Like, there's really nobody really disputes that.
No.
But
In the same way,
connected.
Yeah, but in the same way, like what you said, it's still separate. Like they're one together, but there's still something about it that is weirdly separate. That is like, I don't consider myself. Sometimes you look in the mirror and you're like, that's what I look like. Oh, that's weird. Like sometimes you look in the mirror and you're like, this is exactly everything's going according to plan. And then sometimes you're like, this is like, I guess I haven't looked at myself in the mirror in a little while.
I look in the mirror a lot and think it didn't go according to plan. But
yeah,
it's back to your point, Drew, and we won't keep going on about it, but the idea of emergent, like sort of what would emergent mean because emergent, normally you would think it wouldn't feel so separate. But anyway, let's leave that, because I have a question for both of you, and maybe it's a kind of a final question. But do you feel then, Nick, like, are there times where, because we were talking about sort of more really your own mind and your own working through things and your values and what you would want to be true and that kind of stuff. Does it ever happen that, because obviously theists will occasionally point to more concrete evidence, even scientific evidence sometimes, like people will say, well, what about fine tuning or the Big Bang or something? Do those kinds of things ever come up, or the nature of DNA, like the complexity of DNA is stuff like that? Does anything from like the scientific world ever come into your pathway where you're like, wow, that is kind of, in one sense, I can kind of see that being natural, but another part of me thinks, how are you going to explain that just by random processes, random forces in the universe and stuff, or not really?
Well, I guess what I would say is I definitely try to stick as closely as possible to scientific discoveries. Like if some study is done that disproves without a shadow of a doubt the way that I've thought about something, I'm like, okay, well, I've got to incorporate this into my thinking somehow. I can't just deny it. And I think that a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, like the original Enlightenment scientists, a lot of them were doing various different studies because they were trying to square their Christian faith with what they were discovering about the world around them. And so that's kind of like, I kind of feel like that's a lot of the time where, oftentimes you'll have some kind of scientific fact that gets brought up, and like I said, it comes down to perspective because you can see it in two ways. And I do often lean towards the side that provides me, I guess this would just be a personal thing. It just provides me with more of a sense of meaning and purpose, rather than the other side. And sometimes the side that provides me with a sense of meaning and purpose isn't the Christian side. It may be the more atheist outlook on it. But I definitely do lean towards the theist side more often.
So that's really actually an honest answer. I like that because Drew, don't you think? Because he's just sort of saying, look, okay, here's a fact. The fine tuning for the time being is pretty wild. Like if you really read up on what fine tuning is, we won't go into the details for the listeners just for time's sake, but people can look at it if they want to. But it's the kind of thing that was seen, really discovered, if you want to say that, for the first time around the early 70s, and here we are 50 years later, and physicists are still getting interviewed and talking about God and whether fine tuning in some way points to God, 50 years later. So, and yet he's saying, really, your kind of intuitive perspective on it is probably shaping you more than anything, I think, is the way you're reading that, Nick. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had another thought, but it evaporated from my brain. So yeah, you can go ahead. But
don't you think also, and Drew, this is really just for you, because I agreed with him. I think both of us would say, of course, if science points in a direction, I feel a little bit like Galileo when he's writing his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina saying, these people just need to look through the telescope and they can see, that the moons of Jupiter are orbiting Jupiter. It's not, and it wasn't like it defeated his faith in God, but it's like, this is just what the science shows. So I think you and I both probably would look at science that way. Like science just is what it is. It's sort of dumb in that sense. Nature is dumb and science is just discovering what's there. But what's your sort of reaction to his sort of comment about that maybe it's more perspective that you already have or want to have in the way you interpret these big few things in science that might touch on the question of God?
For sure, yeah. I think it's a Rorschach test for your, for what your proclivities are, how you're, predisposed to react. I mean, you gave a great example in Galileo. A lot of people said, back to Copernicus, it's like if the Earth isn't the center of the universe, then we've been led to believe the wrong thing. That's not sort of the story of, God creating us, and sort of this being the central story. Of course, Christians don't look at it like that now. And sort of the same thing with the fine-tuning thing. If you're predisposed to think, oh, the universe is fine-tuned, well, there you go, atheists. That proves it. God did it. Then you'll see it that way, and if not, then you'll see it as just another brute fact.
Wouldn't you think, though, it's a brute fact that still, like, it does seem on its own terms to leave the reason it's called fine-tuning, right, is because it leaves the impression that it wouldn't have happened without, like, it's not random. I'm saying that just in general, that's the debate. Because of its very nature, it seems fine-tuned, so it doesn't seem random. So it raises a problem. Well,
it's sort of like the logic of the world, like I was talking about. Like, things evolve a certain way because, and I'm assuming that fine-tuning has something to do with evolution, or
no, fine-tuning has to do with what they call the universal constants. It's just the idea that that these big constants in the universe have to be like the relationship of gravity to
if
some
gravity
other force.
Was a little stronger
Right.
or a little weaker, then the universe would either not hold together or it would all compact upon itself. One way or the other.
Yeah, but it's a teeter totter of like it's a teeter totter. So it's it's point oh 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 one
right.
difference, and we couldn't. The universe couldn't sustain life. Yeah, that's the idea.
But
Right,
again,
right,
if we lived in a universe that was not fine tuned, we'd never know it, right? And I think it's sort of the question of like, why does anything exist at all? Why didn't we just Big Bang and then splat, or why didn't we just Big Bang and then just fly off forever before worlds could exist? I think those are fair questions,
which all could have happened, right? And the fact that it ended up with this like teeter totter, yeah, but as you said, in some ways, it's I think the way I tend to view it, I guess, is that there's sort of an inclination. Like I'm going to tend to read that as, hey, I wouldn't say it's proof God exists, but I would say that's the kind of thing that is consistent with the idea that God exists. But I would think if I thought there was nothing directing reality, I would think, well, that is a little in tension with that. There's some tension there, at least. And I'm not quite sure what I would think if I were still an atheist, because I didn't explore it a ton when I was an atheist.
I think it's an interesting question as to why it is the way it is. No more or less interesting than why we exist, or why we evolved, or why we have consciousness, or any of these other questions, which I don't think, from my perspective, don't really point in one direction or another, because a lot of times, one of these questions over the course of the millennia gets answered, and if and that tends to typically go in the atheist camp, I would say, just because a mystery removed is one less need for a God who did it, so to speak. But then again, you can get a discovery like fine tuning that opens up another question. So I just think it's this kind of sort of back and forth, push and pull of questions that are just TBD at this point.
Yeah.
And Nick is am I right? You're just as a final thing here, just to conclude the conversation, you would say what science is helping atheism more than it's helping theism, or is it the reverse?
I'd probably be on the fence about that. I'd say that science oftentimes proves our intuitions correct in certain cases. Like I would say that oftentimes we go through all these different studies, we do all this work, all to come around to the conclusion that we had it right in the beginning based on our intuitions. But we needed to do all that work in order to find out that this was correct beyond a shadow of a doubt. A lot of I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I would need to. I've definitely come across it.
Sure.
Like you could say like the differences between men and women are pretty apparent as far as like if you take data across different cultures. So you got different cultures with different rules, but you take, all these cultures that you're taking are sort of egalitarian cultures that don't really have rules on what men and women should or shouldn't do. And you see that men and women fall into these camps naturally. And so it's like you might go forward with the liberal assumption that men and women are exactly the same and they should be considered the same when it comes to like laws and things like that. But when you're talking about biology, men and women are fundamentally, like, in a lot of different ways different from each other, and you can see how they naturally fall into camps when there's no outside pressuring them to be the same as each other. Women dominate nursing fields and men dominate engineering, and that's just kind of a constant throughout different cultures. And so there are some things where it's like, you have this intuition that men and women are different, but you want to test that. And so you go through and all these tests and you look at all this data, and then it kind of bears out that your original intuition was correct, but we definitely needed to do all that work to make sure.
Mm-hmm. That seems true in some ways, and yet then there's the Einstein stuff, which is less
intuitive.
That time is. Yeah,
yes.
Let's just say less intuitive.
Yes, definitely less intuitive. And there are definitely a lot of times where our intuitions are 100% not correct at all. And so like ancient people, that their kind of conception of the world was that, the world was the earth was at the center and the sun revolved around it, and we were kind of in like a dome, where like the sky was this dome, and then like the water that fell from the sky was like outside the dome.
I thought you were about to say something that was going to tick off all of the flat earthers who listen to our podcast.
I think large maybe number of flat earthers.
I probably did. We're definitely on a sphere, I would say.
By the way, just as a closing thing, I say this to classes every semester, that the flat Earth, the idea that like in the Middle Ages, Columbus thought the world was flat, he was going to sail off the end, or that even worse, in the times of the biblical period, people thought the world was flat and it was going to. That I explained to them that none of this is true. That there wasn't actually a period where people thought the world was flat. They always knew it was round. And it's like, you can always tell they're wondering, am I joking or what? Because they've all heard this. Yeah. And so I'm like, no, really, it's true. Like, just go to Wikipedia even. You can see that, flat earth is like a modern invention.
There are flat earthers today.
Now there are flat earthers, of course. But there weren't in the days of Columbus. Anyway,
my favorite, sorry, just to say the one last thing. My favorite joke about the flat Earth thing is there's just like a picture of like how did the dinosaurs become extinct, and there's just like a picture of like a toy T-Rex on top of like a flat disc of the Earth, and then a meteor hits the other side and flings it off into space, and so that's why there's no dinosaurs anymore.
That's exactly right. Yeah, laws of physics, simple laws of physics. Well, right. Nick, really, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for coming here.
Yeah, appreciate it, Nick.
Talking to us. And so I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, The Divide by iPub. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.